Thank you, and good morning, everyone. I feel very, very honored to be here today. And I feel very out of place among all the distinguished participants. For the last several months, I've been obsessed about this conference, about the only thing I could think about. And whoever was the first person who thought about putting this conference together, and all the people who worked to make it a success, you have my sincere compliments. The title of my paper is 5 Reasons Noah's Ark Did Not Land on Arida and 5 Reasons Why It Did Land on Judida. My paper is too long to read, so I'm going to give you a summary on a PowerPoint. And if you'd like to read the paper, understand that it is soon available in Turkish, and then you can see all my references. So the 5 reasons are, first of all, this is Arida, Ararat, and for a long time I was a fervent believer that the ark landed on this mountain, and I actually climbed to the summit once. It was the hardest thing I ever did physically. And but the more I studied about where Noah's Ark landed, there were probably several dozen people who claimed to be eyewitnesses of the ark. And the more I investigated these people personally, I began to see that there were some problems. But these are the reasons, the 5 reasons: the inadequate testimony from antiquity, geological reasons, geographical reasons. The eyewitnesses are unreliable and contradictory, and despite great efforts, nothing has been found. The first one is inadequate testimony from antiquity. The earliest clear, absolutely clear reference to Mount Ararat is Philostorgius, a historian of the 5th century, but his work did not survive. And we know little about this original work until several hundred years later, when a patriarch of Constantinople quoted extensively from this work. But there are several problems with Philostorgius' testimony. The first one I mentioned already, it did not survive, and all we have is this summary. And we don't know how much of Photius' own ideas went into when he quoted from Philostorgius. Philostorgius was known as a heretic in the church, and Photius was his enemy. Philostorgius misinterprets the Bible to say that the ark landed on Mount Ararat, but the Bible, the Christian Bible, does not mention a specific mountain. It just says mountains, plural, of Ararat. 6, he seems to indicate that the ark was not intact in his day. He has a reference to nails and fragments of wood, and we don't know where he gets this reference. He also had some very bizarre ideas about geography. And so after Philostorgius, we have no clear reference to Ararat until about the 12th or the 13th centuries. And by this time, the 12th and 13th centuries, the traditions about Noah's Ark migrated north to Arida. And when Marco Polo went by there in the 13th century on his way to China, he mentions that Noah's Ark was on Mount Ararat. Reason number 2 are geological reasons. Now, I'm not going to go into detail on this because we have another paper a little later by Ann Habermill, and I think she does an excellent job dealing with the geological problems. But basically there are 2 things. There's no evidence that Mount Ararat was ever submerged in water. There is sediments to be found on the mountain, at least on the south side, but they are sediments resulting from the eruption of the volcano. Also, the motion of the glacial ice would be destructive to a wooden structure, and a glaciologist told me that even the cap ice and so-called station areas are not really very stable. A third reason is geographical reasons, and this is really, I think, the strength of my paper. This is really my main point, and you're going to have to, I probably spent 10 pages on this alone in the paper. But Mount Ararat itself is not part of the Urartian mountain chain. It's in a plain all by itself, a volcano. The key verse in Genesis 8:4 says the ark landed in the mountains, plural, of Urartu. It does not say it landed in the kingdom or country of Urartu. There are three very authoritative sources that agree that the Urartian mountains at the time of Genesis was written were the mountainous range just above Mesopotamia, just north of ancient Assyria. It's what we see out back. And these three sources are Paul Zemansky, Boris Piotrowski, and A.H. Sayce, who was the great linguist who translated the cuneiform at Lake Vaughan. Now, reason 4, the eyewitnesses are often not credible and are contradictory. Once I began investigative work of these people that claim to have seen Noah's Ark, it was not hard to find out that these people were not telling us the truth. Every human being wants to feel significant, and sometimes we tell stories that feel significant. Also, if you do a study of all the different stories of people claiming to see Noah's Ark, you find that they're very contradictory. There are also, probably the most famous case, in my opinion, is the alleged Russian discovery of World War I. According to this story, a Russian airplane flew over Mount Ararat, and he claimed that there was a small lake, and in this small lake was a very black object that looked like a submarine. He reported it to his officials, and these officials mounted an expedition of about 100 Russian soldiers, which took many weeks to get there in the middle of winter, and they claimed that it was Noah's Ark, and they supposedly took wood and a report to the Tsar, but at that time the Bolshevik Revolution developed and everything was lost. Well, I know this story is not true because I personally communicated with the author that made up the story, but this story circulated all over the world in tract form. There's another elaborate story that was spun by a World War II soldier who was stationed in Iran, and he did a favor for some people who were known as the Lures in Luristan, and they, as a result of him doing a favor for them, they claimed they were going to take him and show him Noah's Ark. And he spins an elaborate story about seeing Noah's Ark and claimed it was broken at one point in 2 pieces and another time in 3 pieces. He's another person that I talked to personally on the phone and in person, and I found that the man was not credible at all. Then there's a most recent discovery by a Chinese Christian group aided by a local man who claimed that there is a cave on Mount Ararat, and inside this cave it's actually compartments of Noah's Ark. Now, there are also some legitimate reasons why honest people claim to have seen the Ark on Mount Ararat. Since Ararat is a volcanic mountain, there are large blocks of basalt, and given the right light and shadows, they can become phantom arcs. And here's an example. Over on the left-hand corner, you can see a very straight line, and if it were darker, you could see that this looks like a very interesting object. It looks like it could be a barge like Noah's Ark. And that photograph had kept me awake for several nights. But people have gotten back to that site, and there's nothing there. And what that object is, I still don't know to this day, but it is a phantom ark. Here's another one. If you can see, this was taken in a telephoto, and you can see that it looks like a boat-like object sitting there with snow on the top. Another eyewitness claimed that it looked like this. It was stuck in the ice and part of it was sticking out, and there was a big hole in one end. You can see the hole in the ark. Well, later we found this object. I don't know, this is probably not very clear, but this I think is from a satellite, and it looks just like that drawing. But we have a friend that went down to that site, and it's nothing but a rock. Here's another one. This is an interesting one. This is a big block of basalt, and I didn't have the right photograph, but when you go to Dubai and you're in the Hotel Ararat and you look up at the mountain, you see this big black spot up there. And the first time I saw that, I looked at it for hours with my binoculars and camera and everything. I wondered what in the world that is. The natives refer to it as the eye of the bird. And I do have a friend that got actually to that site, and it is a rock, it's basalt. Why it sticks out like that, it may be that it's a hot spot, I don't know, I'm not real sure. Now, reason number 5, why I believe that it's not on Mount Ararat, it has been thoroughly searched. Hundreds of thousands of dollars have been spent on helicopters, planes, and satellites, and a lot of interesting things show up that they're phantom arcs. When they're investigated, they're not really there. Also, there was a person who spent a lot of money renting a plane, and he flew over the mountain with a very expensive mapping camera. He took 900 overlapping stereo pairs, 10-inch by 10-inch transparencies that were magnified 300 times. And he had a NASA scientist examine these 300 photographs, and they found nothing unnatural on the mountain. So these are 5 reasons why I think the ark landed on Chudida. The search still continues, by the way, on Mount Ararat, and I believe that the main reason is because the hope that an intact ark can be found, and that hope dies hard. So 5 reasons why it landed on Chudida. I think that there is a consensus of very diverse ancient witnesses that point to Chudida. They are, wait a minute. They are Christian, Jewish, and Islamic sources. And these traditions go back thousands of years, hundreds of years anyway. Over the millenniums, wait a minute, something is wrong with my slides here. They seem to be out of order. Yeah. Oh, I see what I'm doing here. I'm giving you a summary. I'm telling you what I'm going to tell you, and then I'm going to tell you. So there is a consensus of diverse witnesses. Over the millenniums, the ark, I believe, has been seen by thousands. It was dismantled in the 12th century. Olives did not grow olives did grow in the Jizra plain in antiquity, but never at the latitude of Mount Ararat, and that's an important point that I'll mention later on. Remains may have been seen in modern times by a German and a Turkish scientist. Chudida is more accessible for the disembarking of the ark. Very, very difficult for Mount Ararat. Now, there is a consensus of very diverse ancient witnesses that point to Chudida. These witnesses are pagan, Jewish, Christian, and Islamic. A very important pagan source is Berosus, a 3rd century BC historian. And he mentioned that a portion of the ship which came to rest in Armenia still remains in the mountains of the Kurdians of Armenia. And there are many spellings of Kurdi. In fact, I have a chart that I didn't have prepared of the different ways in history that it's spelled. It's spelled with a G, a Q, a K, and many different ways. What's interesting about this reference is that Berosus knew about the Mesopotamian flood story, and he knew that the Mesopotamian flood story says the ark landed on a mountain in eastern Iraq, on Pir Omar Gudron. But yet he changes it at this point to a mountain of the Kurds in Armenia. Then there are three Jewish sources. They are the Targums, the Pseudepigrapha, and the first century historian Josephus. The Targums, well, something else seems to be out of order here. Let's look at Josephus. Josephus mentions the ark's landing place. He's a first century Jewish historian who wrote in Greek, and he mentions the ark's landing place on 5 different occasions. He says, on the top of a certain mountain in Armenia, and then 2, there is still a part of this ship in Armenia on the mountains of the Cordyaeans, and that is his quote from Berosus. And then a third quote is in Minyas on a mountain called Baris. This is from Nicholas of Damascus. And then in a fourth quote in Charon in the country of Ad-Diamene, which was a Jewish kingdom that extended to this area. And I believe that Charon is a misinterpretation, assuming that Josephus was reading from a Jewish text. The Resh and the Daleth can very easily be confused, and if that is the case, then he was simply saying Pardu, which is another spelling of Purdy. And then finally he says, on the heights of the mountains of Armenia, that very unspecific source. Now there are 9 Christian sources: Theophilus, Bishop of Antioch, Eusebius, Saint Ephraim, a Syrian, Jerome, the Preshedo, another Syrian translation of the Bible in the 5th century, which may have been circulating as early as the 1st, Epiphanius, 4th century, Chrysostom, and Isidore, and Eutychius. Now, what is interesting is that some of these say that the ark was still seen in their days. It was still intact. Now, the Islamic sources that I give, now obviously I'm not going to spend much time on these because I'm not going to pronounce them right, for one thing. And there are authorities here who know much more about these Islamic sources than I do. The first is the Holy Quran, the 7th century, says specifically Al-Judi. Now there is a Muslim encyclopedia that says these mountains are in Saudi Arabia, and I do not think he is correct at this point. Prophet Muhammad was very familiar with Christian and Jewish sources, and before he became a prophet, he had a career as a merchant, and I believe he came to this area as far east as Jizra. So he would have known about the tradition. Here are some of the other ones. Al-Masudi, a scholar from Baghdad in the 10th century, he said, Al-Judi is in the country of Mazur in Jizra. It is still seen, remains can be seen in the 10th century. Ibn Hakel says that he was a scholar from Baghdad in the 10th century. He says remains were still seen. Ibn al-Amid, or al-Masin, historian of the 13th century, notes that Heraclius climbed Judi in the 7th century after he conquered the Persians. Zakaria ibn Muhammad al-Kazvini, a very interesting geographer from the 13th century, says wood was still seen in the 8th and 9th century, but wood was removed to build a mosque in the 13th century. Well, it's interesting. I have no idea about this, but the mosque in Jizra was built in the 13th century. Probably there are others here who can give me more enlightenment about that. But the second reason why I believe the ark landed on Judi now is over the millenniums, thousands have seen the ark. People of all faiths would annually climb to the site on September 14th, last weekend, to offer sacrifices. And I believe the scholars believe the ark was probably built in southern Mesopotamia out of Cyprus, and it was covered inside and out with some kind of pitch, which means it would have been preserved perhaps for a few thousand years. At least 3 kings may have seen the ark, and I found out that there may be a 4th, another Assyrian king on the way here. But Ashurnashirpal and Sennacherib, we know that there's proof that they were there. Gordon Franz is going to enlighten us about whether or not Sennacherib actually worshipped a piece of wood from the ark. A third reason why the ark landed in Chudida, it can be documented that olives grew in the village of Shah, which I believe today is Chalion, in antiquity. I have a reference for that. But olives do not grow that far north as Agreda. That may be a very minor reason, but an important one, I think. A fourth reason why the ark, I believe, landed on Chudida is I have evidence. I have not seen these, but there are people who claim that they have found 9-inch bronze spikes at the site. 2, German and Turkish scientists have found wood at the site, and Timo Roller is going to tell us about the German scientist and what he found in his paper. Now this Turkish, do you know how to pronounce that word? Yannick? Yes, he's famous for his knowledge of ancient petroglyphs, and he claims that he has found ancient wood at the site. A fifth reason why the ark landed in Chudida, it is easily conceivable how the passengers could have disembarked from the ark on Chudida. It is very difficult to imagine this from the altitude and terrain of Mount Ararat. Now, in conclusion, I believe some of the greatest archaeological discoveries in the future will be made in the Jizra Plain. The village of Timanan, supposedly the first city built after the flood, according to ancient sources, is under the ruins of Shah. I have very good sources for that. The local tradition here is that the village of Heshton may be the site of the first village after the flood.